Well, good morning again. Glad to see everybody. And we're getting to that exciting time of year, as I said, where it's like everything starts coming back into a rhythm. If you're a parent, all of a sudden, now you got to work on bus schedules and all that. Looking forward to it. I have a kindergartner this year, which is freaking me out. But it's going to be interesting to see how he adapts and all that. But for those of you that are a guest, I want to catch you up really quickly. We had this series that we started called Creeping Death. We've been talking specifically about sin, something that you think churches talk about all the time about, but we wanted to look at it from a few different angles. We used two stories from the Bible over the last 2 weeks. The first one that we talked about was David, and how David took baby steps to destruction. Literally, David never aspired to be a murderer, but through one step after another, he worked his way up to be something he never in a million years would have dreamed himself being. We talked about that in our own life, that sometimes we take baby steps to bigger, worse things that we never would have thought we would have gotten to. Last week, we talked about Achan. Achan was an individual who hid his sin, and as a result, it cost the life of him, his family, and many others because he hid sin. And we talked about how we sometimes hide sin, and the cure for that is confessing to each other as well as to the Lord our sin. Today, we're not so much going to talk about another story, but today we're going to talk about a passage out of Romans chapter 1 and really take a look at this picture of a person that is just absolutely 100% sold out, not for God, but for sin, and to live in a sinful way, a depraved mind, you would say. And in fact, the scripture does say that we're going to look at today. Now, you may not know this, but one of the more popular movies out right now is about a figure that most of you would never in 1,000 years probably think there'd be a movie about, and that is Mr. Rogers. This movie is out, Won't You Be My Neighbor, right now. It's a documentary on the life of Mr. Rogers. How many admit that you like Mr. Rogers? Okay. I wasn't allowed to watch him. I don't know why. I think it was he was too nice, and that freaked us out, because who's really that nice? So sweet that he would put his finger in a cup of unsweetened tea, and it'd be sweet tea in about 2 seconds. That's you'll get that later. Anyway, Fred Rogers was an interesting guy because you may not realize this, but he was an ordained Presbyterian minister. He decided not to go into ministry, though. You see, he saw all the stuff that was on TV, all the violence, all the anger, all the crime, all that, and he decided that he was going to go into television to make a show that was everything the opposite of that. And boy, is it ever. Talking about manners and kindness, and he became very nice. And yeah, a lot of people made fun of him because, he was so nice, and yet it was so different that it's been popular. Now, this movie about him has been raved about. There's a website, Rotten Tomatoes, which people can sort of rate movies if they liked them or didn't like them, as well as critics. And this is one of the few movies that its review is at 99% of the people who have rated it have been a high, 5-star review for this. They love this movie. It's said that when you go to see this, oftentimes at the very end when the credits roll, there are people still sitting in the theater crying. Now, why on earth would a documentary about Fred Rogers cause people to cry? They believe that the reason this is having such an impact is because it's really dealing on the fact that he was about kindness. And in our day and age, and trying to see good things, it's so the opposite of what we see around us. And people are going to it, and it's like a message that they needed to hear, to almost take a breath in the middle of our culture of being kind again, of treating each other like a neighbor again. One of Mr. Rogers' most well-known quotes, and you may know it, but was one, he was talking about when he was raised by his parents. They really tried to protect him from a lot of the bad stuff on TV, the news, and so on. And he said this, he's like, when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. To this day, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words, and I am always comforted by realizing that there are still so many caring people in this world. Now, some would say this is sort of a Pollyanna mindset. just that you're trying to find good in bad times and always look for the bright side of life and so on. And you know what? There's truth that we need to do that. I would say this, and this is really what we're going to talk about today, is just that we have to get into really dark, bad times to see good. And good sticks out in those dark times in a very real way. And our big idea today is actually that tremendous darkness reveals magnificent light. Tremendous darkness reveals magnificent light. You could say that Mr. Rogers was strange by the fact that he tried to find helpers in the midst of stuff such as 9/11 and terrible things like that. But there is some good there. And you see the good there. And that's what he was really getting at. Look for the positive. Look for the good. Because tremendous darkness always reveals magnificent light. It's very easy for you and I that when things are getting bad in our culture, in our world, in our lives, that we can be often overcome by darkness. It can feel so oppressive and so heavy that we just give in and we become depressed. We have no hope. And you may have been there. You may be there now. You may be there in a month. But I want to offer today light for our life, a magnificent light. The passage of Scripture that we're going to deal with in Romans 1 is one that's pretty dark. But before you think that we're just going to end there and say a prayer and leave and all go around with, our heads down and poor me and wow, life is terrible, I want to offer some more verses after that come a little bit later that remind us of the magnificent light that we have in our lives. How many of you know why a jeweler puts diamonds on black velvet or a dark color? Anyone know? I'm not going to make you answer, out loud. Nobody knows. Wow. I feel like such a jeweler today. That's awesome. Here's why. If you put a diamond on something that's, we'll say, white velvet, yeah, you'll see it. But it kind of blends in a little bit. When you put a diamond or diamonds on black velvet, it makes them pop. You see their sparkle clearer than you would on any other color. You see their purity clearer than any other color. And that's why they do it, because you see how pure and bright and sparkling the diamond is. So it is with our lives. That in the midst of dark times, they should sparkle. And so should Jesus. So should Jesus. So today we're going to start with darkness. And it's this passage out of Romans 1. We're going to look at a couple verses out of this towards the end. I want to sort of set it up by this. This is what the depraved mind looks like. This is what the mind that wants nothing to do with God looks like. And I need us to feel that darkness. I need us to feel that weight because of what it reveals, the magnificent light. But we're going to start with tremendous darkness. And in Romans 1, starting in verse 18, it says this: the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. I want to pause there. The wrath of God. That sounds pretty intense. The wrath of God. I don't know about you, but when growing up, when I heard that phrase, all I could picture is like God is there with this fist, and he's just looking to smash something. You've had those days where it's like the wrath of you comes out. You put your hand into a wall. Hopefully not, because that does damage to your knuckles. But anyway, you get the idea. The wrath of God, it's almost this picture of smashing something and someone who's just ticked off. That's not what this is referring to here. This is not an emotional response from God where he's just like, oh, this is making me mad. People are sinning. I'm going to smash them. That's not it. It's God's continual opposition to sin. God knows the destructiveness of sin. He sees the destructiveness of sin that we put in our life. And he sees the destructiveness of it, and he stands opposed to it. God hates sin. So he will oppose the wrath of God. He will oppose sin. And it says that this wrath of God is being poured out on the godlessness. That's people living without any mind, reason, or care to have God involved. They're living minus God. I'm living my life doing my thing. I don't need God in my mind. I don't need to think about him or anything. And in fact, it says there that they suppress the knowledge of him by their wickedness. They literally are like, don't tell me about God, don't tell me about God, I don't care, I don't care, I don't care, I'm going to do my own thing. Just keep it over there, okay? And that's the picture that it starts with. It's a person who is just, I'm fine. I don't need him. I don't want him in my life. That's digging in. That's digging in deep to your life. In verse 19 it says this, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Here's what he's saying. God has made himself known to every human being that is alive. Every human being knows or should know that there is a God. And I'll talk about that in a second because, okay, we're getting ready to hit fall. For once, I'm going to get a New England fall where all my leaves are on the trees and weren't eaten by small gypsy moths, okay? I'm excited. I am so pumped about this fall. And it's going to be fun. And here's why I love fall. Because the beauty out there reveals something about God to me. It reveals his beauty. You look in nature, you take a walk. You see God. You see glimpses of his character and everything around you. Even as horrible as this hurricane was this past week, Hurricane Lane, which I keep wanting to say Penny Lane, the Beatles song. I don't know why. It just keeps defaulting to that. But Hurricane Lane, you saw the power of this storm. Even if something as horrible as that, you see something about God. You see his power. Our God is powerful. And so God reveals himself, and it says he makes it plain to them. He makes it plain to all people. He makes it plain to people that want nothing to do with him. Hey, I'm here, guys. I'm right here. I'm right here. He makes it plain to them so that people are without excuse. He makes sure that people have no excuse to say they don't believe in God or there is no God because he's given enough evidence. Now, this is actually, I'm going to impress you with my seminary knowledge here, okay? So prepare to be blown away. If I see your hair fly back, it's going to be a good sign. But seminary, you take a class called apologetics, which is a defense of the faith. Some of you have taken classes in this. It's where you really learn how to defend Christian faith and arguments for the faith and so on. One of those first arguments that I learned is one that's actually pretty widely known, and it's called the teleological argument. You can use that this week, just so you know, at your job. They'll think you're amazing. But teleological argument is this. When you take a look at creation, when you take a look at the complexity of creation, you have to deduce that there was a maker. There was a creator. It's like me. If I go walking out in the field and all of a sudden I see this book like laying, on the ground, I'm not going to come upon it and go, oh my goodness, look at this accident that happened. And look, it's got words in it, and this is awesome. It all just happened by accident. It came to be. No, if I see this book in the field, I'm going to, number one, wonder who left it behind. Number two, if I really put some thought into it, I realized that it was an author who had a thought, and they decided to put a pen to paper, so they wrote it down, and then they sent it to a publisher, and the publisher put it together and bound it and all that, and you have a book. When I look at a book, I know that there were people behind the creation of this book. This did not happen by chance. This did not happen by accident. And so it is, why God reveals himself in nature is that people don't have an excuse for saying, I didn't know there was a God. I didn't know there was a God. There's also something wired in every human being, and that is this thing of right and wrong. And that's the fact that there's a moral lawmaker. And here's what I mean by that. If we go down to McDonald's after church, and I walk in, and I just decide I'm going to just cut right in front. There's 10 people in line. I just walk up and, oh, excuse me, and to the front of the line and start giving my order. Are the people that are behind me going to get upset? You could say yes. It's the right answer. Yes, they better, or they have a problem. Yes. Well, why? I was hungry. I went and got food. Well, because they know it was wrong, what I did. Well, how did they know it was wrong? Was it because they watched Mr. Rogers and he said it was wrong? Or was it there was something deeper wired within them that told them something isn't right here? Something's not right. We have a moral lawmaker who wires within us this understanding of good and bad, right and wrong. And again, another evidence for God with this. And God wires it even in the most hardened atheist who does not believe that there is a God. God has wired them to, number one, be observant to the world around and to have to know that there was someone that made it. It's not just accident. And number two, the whole moral lawmaker piece. They know right and wrong. I guarantee if I have 10 atheists in line at McDonald's and I cut right in front of them, all 10 atheists are going to be upset. And it's not because I'm keeping them from their Big Macs. It's because I did something wrong. And yet they know that because something's been wired in them. Anyway, that's what this is setting up here. God has given everyone evidence. He's wired it in everyone. And now we move forward. Verse 28, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. So they didn't think it was worthwhile to God. Yeah, okay, whatever, fairy tale, whatever. It's useless knowledge to me. How does he impact my life? It says, since they had that mindset, since they resisted believing in everything that they see and experience is wired in them because they were just like, whatever. It says here that God gave them over to their depraved mind. God gave them over. God was like, okay, I've given you signs. I've put everything in front of you. You're still refusing to believe? Okay, go for it. You know better. Go for it. And it's not that God's not caring, because we know from the scripture, it's not that he's being mean in any way. Some of you experience this as a parent, right? Your 13-year-old knows better than you, just so you know, because they've had a lot more life experience than you. They know, obviously, more about the world than you because you're old and all that. And so there comes some times as a parent where you keep trying to explain to them, keep trying to tell them no, and there comes times, as long as they're not going to do damage to themselves or to other people, that you're just like, okay, have at it. And you know how it's going to end. And then at the end of it, you bring them back to you, and you're like, you have to watch that you're not going, yeah, I told you so, because then they get all offended with that. But you get the idea where sometimes, even as a parent, you have to take the step back and let them learn the lesson. And it's almost this picture of God doing that, where it's like, okay, you know better than me. You have better solutions than what I'm playing for you. All right, let's see how that works out, and I'll be over here. And it's almost that thing where God allows the depraved mind. And this word depraved here, by the way, that's pointed out, it's a term actually used for metal that has so much impurity in it that a person who works with metal can't do anything with it, and they cast it out. And the idea here is that a person with a depraved mind is so full of sin that there's no use. There's no use even trying to do anything with them. It says this one phrase here that God, I actually skipped over a verse, but that's okay. It says that he exchanged the truth for a lie. Exchange the truth for a lie gets repeated 3 times in this passage. And not just that, there's another phrase that gets repeated 3 times. Whenever something is repeated, it means pay attention to it. And the second one is coming up. In verse 28, as I said, verse 29, it says this, they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. Catch this. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. That's how debased they are. That's how deprived they are. And it says that God, he hands them over to that. You think you know better? Go for it. It also says that they exchange the truth of God for a lie. They exchange the truth of God for a lie. They believe they know better than him. They worship things he created rather than worshiping him. It says in an earlier verse, in fact, it says, you know what this is like. You do something really good, really bold, and somebody else gets the credit for it. Has anyone ever gone through that? It's happened to me. You do something nice for a person, or you do a great job at your workplace, and someone else is giving credit. It's almost that picture. That's what happens with God. And so they exchange the truth of God for a lie, and he just lets them live that way because they're not even giving him honor or praise in any way. And it talks about all these different ways they sin. And it says that they even invent new ways of sinning. They are sin innovators. Sinovators. There we go. There's a new term. Sinovators. They literally will find a way to sin. They don't just sit around, you know what, hey, cheating and lying, that's all old school. I'm going to find a new way to lie. It's literally they are intent upon living sinfully. And they let their mind run wild. And that's the sign of a depraved mind. That's the sign of a mind that has no desire to follow God. It is 100% against him. And verse 31 says this, they have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, and that's talking about eternal death, they not only continue to do these very things, but they also approve of those who practice them. Now, it's not enough that they're just inventing things. Now they're like, oh, you like that kind of sin? Awesome, awesome. I support you. Go for it. Do it as much as you can. They almost give themselves the label of tolerant. We studied 1 Corinthians a few months ago. And 1 Corinthians, one of the things we didn't even spend any time on was within the church in Corinth, there were sins going on within the church that were shocking those outside of the church. There were sins going on inside the church that were shocking the world that didn't even follow Jesus. And the attitude of the people in the church is, well, look at how good we are. We have this person right here. Aren't we so tolerant? And they were saying nothing to try to steer this person back to Jesus. They were applauding themselves and thinking about how tolerant they were. This is a sign of depravity. This is a sign of a person who has totally turned on God. And that's really the root of this whole passage, is a person who knows the truth and refuses to believe it. They are dug in, not looking back, 100% sold out to sin and not following Jesus. This is a passage that is not talking about believers. This is a passage talking about those who have no relationship with Jesus. And we can look at this and we can say, this is dark. Man, way to go, Dan. You just made a whole downer of my Sunday. There's brightness coming. Because remember, tremendous darkness reveals magnificent light. We're going to talk about the magnificent light in a second. The reality comes down to people choose to believe the lie. And the lie is the fact that they know better than God. There's a story that I heard on a podcast a while back, and it's about a guy named Don Lowry. This is back in the 70s or 80s. Don Lowry was a guy who started a pen pal service, but it was a unique pen pal service. Don Lowry targeted single men who were lonely. And he set up his pen pal catalog with all these beautiful women that were all models. And what would happen is he would put the catalog out there, a single lonely guy would see it and go, wow, really attracted to this woman. I want to write her. So for a small sum of money, he could send money in and start to write this angel, as they would call him. On the other end of that was Don Lowry. Don Lowry would write romantic letters back, really just to mess with them. And this started to grow and grow and grow, and more lonely men started coming to this. The story started to get crazy. Don Lowry would write them stories back, from the angel and say, wow, our house, we had a hurricane come through, and we don't have a place to live. Could you possibly send some money to help us out? And these lonely men who are being taken advantage of and didn't even realize that we're sending checks. And Don Lowry made up this whole story about Sandra Za was the land that these people lived in, and there were goddesses and all this stuff there, and these men kept writing. There was this fantasy that had been developed, and he would just write these letters back, and he was entertained and amused by it. Well, the gig was up. He's arrested. He goes to trial for this, for fraud. The shocking part of the story is not that and how he messed with these individuals. The shocking part was the trial, because at the trial, many of the ones who were victims of his fraud defended him. And the reason they defended him was they knew it was a lie, but they didn't want to believe it was a lie. They wanted to continue the fantasy that they had felt wonderful writing this angel. And it made them feel alive and worth something, even though it was a lie. And so it is that those that are depraved and have turned their back on God, they believe the lie that they know better than God, that they can find a better life apart from him. And it's dark. But here's the brightness. Here's the magnificent light. A few chapters later, starting in verse 5, it says this: "Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ." Remember at the beginning, the definition we had for sin was that it's breaking shalom with God, or it's breaking shalom with each other, where we're at fault. Now this verse says, because of Jesus, we can have peace with God. He justifies us. He makes us right in our sinfulness. If we give our life, we commit to be a Christian, we turn from our life of sin, you are made right. You are made right. Everything is back to where it was meant to be. We have peace with God again. And I hope we want that. And the beauty of that is that God loved you that much that he wanted a relationship with you. He pursued you. And later on in verse 6 or 8, it says this: "You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly." That's the very ones we just read about in chapter 1. He dies. "Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God goes a step further. He demonstrates his love to us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While you and I were still sinners, when we are at the worst of the worst, he died for you." Think back to your lowest point in life spiritually. Maybe that was after Christ, but a lot of times for some of us it was before Christ. Think of that lowest point and how your life was. Think of the ugliness in our life, the sinfulness, all of it. The consequence, the pain. Once you've thought about that low point, this verse says that when you were at that low point, when you were at your worst that you have ever been, Christ died for you. And not just that, in that moment, he gave you grace and forgiveness and justification and mercy and love and a future and a hope and a brand new start. When you were at your worst, he was at his best. And I hope that gives you hope this morning. It gives me hope. And that's this true brightness that no matter how dark the world is getting around us, no matter how ugly everybody is treating each other and how corrupt our world becomes, Jesus shines brighter than all of it. And not just that, that also means something else. And we can see this in Philippians 2:14-15. It says this: "Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked, and I might add, dark generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky." Not only in the midst of darkness is Christ shine brighter like a diamond, we shine like stars. We shine like stars because we are living like him. We are acting like him. We're treating each other like he would. We're speaking as he does. And we can't help but stick out. You can't help but stick out. If you're truly living a life for Christ, it is so radically different than the world around you, you stick out. I said this with the last series. I'm going to say it again, and you'll hear it 1,000 more times. You are not called to live a normal life. None of us. I have not been called to live a normal life. I'm called to live a life of Christ. Out in the world that sticks out, that people see something is different. That my coworkers, if I'm working out in a workplace here, they see something different in how I treat people, how I treat my boss. That your kids see something different in the way that you treat each other as a married couple, that they see that you're different than maybe even some of their friends' parents who have no relationship with Christ, that the people at the PTO meetings or the PTA meetings at school see that maybe you're not, someone who's shouting down the teacher and the superintendent and all that, and that they're worthless and so on. You're the person that's actually affirming and building up and speaking truth, but doing it in a Christ-honoring way. That is how you shine like stars. And as this world continues to divide and polarize and get darker and more hateful and resentful of each other, the church has to be different. We have to be different in East Hampton and Portland and Glastonbury and Colchester and all the places you all are from. We must be different. We must shine like stars. And how do you do that? It's by pursuing Christ and living like him. Jesus bore the full wrath of God for us. The full wrath of God. Get your mind around that. He bore it all. It's as though we are all standing here and he is here and he's just taken everything that God can throw at him, the wrath of God, because of sin, our sin. He wasn't even sinful. If you have no relationship with him, I hope that makes an impact on you. That there is someone who loves you desperately, is willing to forgive you and give you a future and a hope. That should change everything in your life, and that you can have a relationship with him. I hope you have that desire. Tremendous darkness reveals magnificent light. Our God is awesome. No matter how bad things may get in our world, I will always see Jesus above it all. And I hope we are seen above it all as we shine like stars in heaven. My challenge for you this week is this: hold on to the hope despite the darkness around you. Hold on to hope despite the darkness around you. There is hope for everyone. Even the people talked about in Romans 1 that are so dead set against Christ. How many atheists have actually turned to Christ? A lot. There is no one in your life who is beyond hope. That Jesus can still do a work in their life and change their heart, change their direction of life. Don't give up hope. And in the midst of darkness, hold on to the hope that we have peace with God. Our shalom can be restored with God and with each other. And I hope we live a little differently in that as we move forward as a church. I don't know about you, but that's where my hope is. And I'll put my full hope there the rest of my life. That Jesus is everything. And that he can change anyone. And that I have a future with him. How awesome is that? Let's pray. God, thank you for bearing the full wrath, Jesus. We thank you for bearing that. We thank you for taking our punishment. We thank you for loving us when we were at our absolute worst, for going the extra mile and being our absolute best when we were at our absolute worst. Lord, if there's anyone here today that has no relationship with you, that today would be the day they say, I choose to follow Jesus and turn from my sin. That I choose to live like him and be like him and know him and experience him. Lord, for those of us that are believers, I pray a couple things. I pray first that you would give us a burden for those around us that have no hope. That you would give us a burden for those that have turned their back, no matter how far gone they may be, that you will burden our hearts for them, and that we would seek to introduce them to the most amazing, beautiful thing in the midst of this darkness that we have, and that is Jesus. Lord, for the second thing I pray is, Lord, if there's anyone here without hope that have they become overcome by darkness in their life because of sin or whatever, Lord, I'm asking that you would remind them of the hope that you give, Lord, that all of us, I pray, would shine like diamonds wherever we are, whatever town we live in, wherever we work, you name it, Lord. That our lives would be radically different. And not just because we try to make it that way, but because you have changed us. And we want to see you change more lives, Jesus. And so, we lift this up to you, Lord. Make us shine bright. Give us future, and thank you for the hope we have in you. We ask this in your name. Amen.